A mother works day and night to pay for her sick son's treatment, but when she finally manages to get the money, she discovers that her son has been hiding a truth that will break her heart. The dawn was just breaking when Mary was already up in a small apartment where silence was her only companion at that hour. She observed, as she did every morning, the calm face of her son David as he slept. His youthful features contrasted with her deep, dark circles, and for a moment she thought about how easy it was to forget the burden of his illness when he looked so serene and oblivious to the struggles of daily life. The clock read 5:30, and Mary knew it was time to start. Her routine was meticulously planned because every minute counted in the difficult task of gathering the necessary money for her son's treatment. David, her son, had stomach cancer, which he developed when he was just 15. He hadn't had a long childhood or adolescence, as he had to grow up quickly after the treatments, pain, and rejection from his schoolmates. He did not grow up in a time that would make Mary proud, so she prepared coffee and a modest portion of bread for breakfast without haste, determined to work hard for a better future for her son. She knew her health was fragile, but she also knew she couldn't afford to get sick. David needed her strong, or at least pretending to be. She left home before 6, leaving David still asleep, and headed to her first job of the day. The sun was just peeking over the horizon when she arrived at the door of a large, shiny house in a neighborhood where life seemed to pass by without a care. There, amid marble floors and impeccable furniture, Mary dedicated herself to cleaning as if she were wiping away her own sorrows with each stroke of the cloth. Each room she left spotless was a reflection of her determination to keep her life and David's in order. However, her mind constantly wandered back to her son, to the silent battle he fought with his illness, which stole his mobility and hope with each step. By noon, Mary barely had time for a quick lunch, consisting of an apple and a bottle of water. She sat for a moment in a nearby park, where children laughed and played carefree. Watching them, she couldn't help but think of David as a child, in those days when she still had her husband by her side, and life seemed to make more sense. Yet those memories no longer hurt as much. They had turned into a quiet resignation, a certainty. She was all David had. As the afternoon progressed, her steps took her to the factory. There, the night shift began with the mechanized routine of machines and the metallic sound of constant work. The factory was her second job, and it was undoubtedly the most exhausting. As soon as she entered, the bright lights and incessant noise reminded her that there was still a long way to go before she could rest. It wasn't long before her boss, Anna, made her presence known, strutting through the halls like a hawk, watching every move and demanding efficiency with a harsh, disapproving tone. Anna was an intimidating figure for many, but Mary knew she had to endure. She couldn't risk losing the job, not when David depended on it. So, even though her body craved a break, she kept her posture and pace, completing every task assigned to her without allowing her face to show the fatigue she truly felt. The night dragged on slowly, and tension and exhaustion seemed to multiply in her body. However, not everything was bleak in that place. Claire, her longtime friend, shared the shift with her, and always found a moment to come over and say a word of encouragement or make her smile. Claire knew what Mary was going through, and although she couldn't always alleviate the burden, it was comforting to feel that someone understood her pain. That day, Claire approached with a cup of hot tea, a simple gesture that lit up Mary's face. "Girl, do you realize you're like a rock?" Claire said in her soft yet firm tone. "Not just anyone could endure so much and keep going with that strength." Mary smiled faintly, grateful for her friend's words, although her mind insisted on reminding her that she had no other option. "I don't know if I'm strong or if I just have no choice, Claire," Mary replied softly, her fingers grazing the warm cup. "David needs me, and that's all that matters." Claire nodded in understanding. She knew that Mary concealed her pain and exhaustion behind that strong facade, but she also knew that inside her was a heart full of fears and broken dreams. At the end of her shift, Mary walked home slowly, each step revealing her accumulated fatigue. The night was cold, and as she crossed the empty streets, she thought of David and how she had to strive every day to be his support. No matter what she had to endure or sacrifice, he was worth it all. Arriving home, exhausted but at peace, she entered quietly. David had, as usual, left a lamp on in the living room for her, and that small light returned a spark of hope. She walked to her son's room and watched him sleep once more, as if that image gave her the strength to face the next day. Finally, she sighed and went to bed, knowing that the same battles awaited her the next day, but also with the certainty that her love for her son would give her the strength to win them. That was Mary's life, a constant cycle of sacrifice and love, resilience and hope. David opened his eyes with the first light of morning filtering through the window. He knew his mother was already gone, as she was every day, and that absence filled him with a mix of relief and sadness. Relief because he could enjoy a few moments of silence and solitude. Sadness because he knew Mary, his mother, was exhausting herself to pay for the treatment that he increasingly felt he no longer wanted. Sitting on the bed, David looked at his hands, thin and fragile, visible signs of the illness advancing in his body. At 18, he felt older than he should, as if his soul had traveled a long, bumpy road filled with scars. Since his health began to deteriorate, time felt different to him. Days seemed slow, heavy, and the hours, which for other kids his age were a promise of adventures and dreams to fulfill, were nothing more than a reminder of his limitations and the uncertainty of his future. He gazed at the photo on the shelf in his room, a blurry image of his childhood where he was with his mother, both smiling in a park. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever feel as carefree as in that frozen moment on paper. He had stopped attending school months ago. His body no longer responded as it used to, and the treatment weakened him to the point of exhaustion after weekly procedures. That decision had been hard for his mother to accept, who had always placed her hopes on education and studies as a way to give him a better future. But for David, each missed class and each day out of the school environment felt, in a way, like a release from that impossible expectation. With his mind wandering, he slowly got up and walked to the window. From there, he could see the park where children played and families strolled on weekends. He used to sit in that park before the disease advanced and took away the mobility and strength needed to walk without help. Now, watching the cheerful bustle from a distance, he felt a deep, confusing desire to distance himself even further from that world, a world full of expectations and hopes that he no longer recognized as his own. During breakfast, which consisted of a toast and a glass of juice his mother had left prepared, his thoughts began to swirl around her sacrifices. He felt torn between gratitude and guilt. He knew that every exhausting job and every sacrifice his mother made was for him, and that reality tormented him. He wondered if it was fair for her to dedicate her life and health to maintaining his, knowing that the hope of recovery was so uncertain. With his gaze lost on the kitchen table, he recalled the nights when he heard his mother's tired footsteps returning from work, her silent sighs, and her trembling fingers as she prepared the next day's breakfast. Those gestures were part of daily life, but for him, they represented something he could no longer bear for much longer. He wondered silently if he truly deserved such sacrifice, if he was worthy of his mother putting everything on hold just for a treatment he was no longer sure he wanted. That day, in an attempt to find clarity, he decided to go to the library. It was one of the few places where he could be alone, while simultaneously losing himself in stories and other worlds. As he walked through the shelves of books, he ran his fingers over the covers as if searching for a sign that would give him answers. He had been reading about philosophy, looking for a kind of peace within its pages, a way to accept his fate without regrets. Sometimes, he found phrases that seemed to be spoken from the heart of someone who had lived his same tragedy, and in those words, David found a measure of comfort. As he flipped through a book of poems, an idea began to take shape in his mind, an idea that had crossed his thoughts before, but felt clearer and more certain this time. What if he stopped the treatment? What if he accepted the illness as part of his life and freed himself from the endless sessions and the waiting for results that almost always brought disappointment? He felt that by renouncing that struggle, he could relieve his mother of the emotional and physical burden of keeping him in a fight he did not wish to prolong. That thought, though painful, granted him a strange and almost unfamiliar peace. It wasn't a peace of resignation, but of acceptance. In his circle of readings and reflections, David was beginning to see his illness as part of his life, something he didn't have to face with resistance, but with serenity. Although that feeling gave him some calm, it also filled him with sadness at the thought of the pain his decision would cause his mother. He knew she wouldn't be able to understand. For her, life was a battle that must be fought until the end. David placed the book of poems back on the shelf and turned to the window of the library, where the view of the street showed people walking quickly, busy with their own affairs, not even noticing his presence. He felt that, like them, he was beginning to distance himself from his mother and the world she had built for him. It hurt, but at the same time, he felt incapable of returning to that place of expectations and sacrifices. Afternoon arrived, and David headed home again. He walked slowly, trying to organize his thoughts, but something inside him had already changed. The decision that had been hovering around him was starting to take shape, like a firm, measured voice that, though he did not want to hear it, he knew would become inevitable. He desired peace, a peace that he might find only in accepting his fate, and that peace was something he could not share with his mother. When he arrived home, he paused at the entrance and took a deep breath before stepping inside. He knew that this decision would mark a turning point in their lives. The neighborhood library had become David's silent refuge, a place where he could disappear among shelves of books and set aside, if only for a while, the burden of his illness and the guilt of his mother's sacrifices. However, that day, something different broke the quiet routine he usually maintained. As he headed to a table in a secluded corner, he heard the light yet vibrant laughter of a group of young people, which seemed unusual in such a solemn place. David tried to ignore them, focusing on the reading of a book on Eastern philosophy he had chosen almost at random. But the laughter and whispered voices distracted him again and again. When he looked up, he met the curious gaze of a dark-haired boy with penetrating eyes who, with a crooked smile, motioned for him to come over. David hesitated, used to maintaining a barrier between himself and the world, but something in the relaxed attitude of those young people intrigued him. He stood up and, almost impulsively, approached the group. The young man who had signaled him introduced himself as Luke, a boy with a rebellious spirit and a direct gaze. Beside him was Anna, a girl with a delicate appearance but intensely expressive eyes, and George, who maintained a calm and observant demeanor. David barely managed to greet them when Luke, without hesitation, offered him a seat and a sincere smile, as if he had been waiting for him for a long time. The conversation began casually, almost like a game of questions about literary tastes and study topics. David, at first, remained reserved, answering with short responses and nervous glances. However, something in Luke's attitude made him feel comfortable. Unlike the pitying or worried looks he usually received from others, they didn't seem to see him as fragile or sick. On the contrary, they treated him like one of the group, and in their eyes, there was no compassion, only genuine curiosity and camaraderie. "So you come here often, huh?" Luke asked, raising an eyebrow with a smile that seemed to challenge the silence David usually kept. David nodded, feeling his words become lighter, as if speaking with them was a breath of fresh air amidst his dense routine of hospitals and uncomfortable silences. "It's peaceful," he finally replied. "It helps clear my mind." Anna watched him with a slight smile. Her face, though young, showed a kind of weariness that David recognized immediately. It was not a physical fatigue, but that of someone who has lived a lot in a short time. With a sweetness that contrasted with the harshness in her words, she said, "We all need a place where we can feel free. For me, art is that, a way to express what I can't say with words." David noticed the paint stains on Anna's fingers and felt fascinated. She was an artist who had found an outlet in art, an escape that, in a way, seemed similar to his own refuge in books and philosophy. For the first time in a long while, David felt he wasn't alone in his way of seeing the world. He shared something in common with them, a kind of shared pain, but each transformed it in their own way. George, who had remained silent until then, looked at David with a deep expression and asked him an unexpected question. "Have you ever wondered if we're here for something more than just existing?" The question left David speechless. It was a query he had tried to solve during his quiet afternoons of reading and reflection. In a low tone, almost a whisper, he responded, "Yes, many times." That exchange marked the beginning of an intense and unique connection among the four of them. David learned that, like him, they also carried invisible wounds that had shaped them. Luke, for instance, had no family. He had spent his youth in a foster home after being abandoned by his parents. That experience had made him strong and independent, a young man who, despite his rebellion, possessed a courage that David couldn't help but admire. Anna, on her part, carried the weight of a terminal illness. It was something she accepted with a calmness and sweetness that surprised David. She spoke of death with a frankness that he found both disturbing and liberating. For her, life was like a painting created day by day, without guarantees or certainties, and each brushstroke was an act of bravery and hope. George, the most introspective of the group, had lost his brother in an accident. That loss had led him to explore spirituality, and his words, filled with wisdom, spoke of acceptance, of finding peace in uncertainty. David felt that with George, he could talk about his fears and doubts without fear of being judged, for his friend's silence always seemed to invite introspection and calm. Each of them carried a story that, in some way, intertwined with his. David felt that, for the first time, he had found people who understood his pain, not because they had the same experiences, but because they too had traversed dark and lonely paths. Together, in that small group, he discovered a freedom that was unfamiliar to him, a sense of belonging that he had never experienced elsewhere. Hours passed, and time ceased to be an enemy in that corner of the library. They talked about their fears, their desires, and about that strange peace that each of them had found, in some way, by accepting their uncertain destinies. David, who at first had felt trapped in his own suffering, began to see life through the eyes of his new friends, and with them understood that existence didn't always have to be a constant battle. As evening fell, Luke gave David a friendly pat on the shoulder and said firmly, "Here, no one has to pretend to be strong. We are who we are, and that's okay." The words resonated with David. For the first time, he felt he didn't need to show the world a facade of strength, nor to comfort his mother with promises of constant fighting. With Luke, Anna, and George, there was no need to pretend. They were young people who, like him, had faced life in its rawest form, and instead of hiding their pain, they shared it openly. That night, as he returned home, David felt different. He had found something in those young people that he had never experienced before, the possibility of being understood without the need for words, and sharing a pain that, until then, he had kept solely for himself. His mother, as always, was awake and smiled when she saw him come in. David returned the smile, but for the first time in a long time, the look he carried was not marked by resignation, but by a strange and calm sense of belonging. As he prepared for bed, he thought about his new friends and the relief he felt knowing he had found a space where he could be himself without reservations. Weeks passed, and David began to spend more and more time with his new friends. In the library, at the plaza, or in some secluded corner of the park, the group gathered without a fixed schedule, with the sole intention of being there for one another, sharing their darkest thoughts and secret longings. Little by little, what had started as a series of chance encounters transformed into a deep bond that, for David, became an escape from the reality and expectation of struggle surrounding him at home. Luke, always with a carefree attitude and a spark of rebellion in his eyes, seemed to lead the group with an energy that was contagious. Although at first glance his life might appear solitary and difficult, David discovered that behind his independence was a young man who, while resentful of his past in foster care, had learned to turn abandonment into strength. For Luke, life was a series of trials, and he was determined to overcome them without depending on anyone. In his words, David found a kind of inspiration and courage, a philosophy that spoke to him of resilience and taught him to face life without expecting too much. Sometimes, people only stay with you while it's easy, Luke explained one afternoon as they sat on a park bench. I learned that if you want something in life, you have to be able to endure it alone, because not everyone stays when things get tough. David listened intently, admiring the way Luke faced his reality. On one hand, he felt grateful not to have experienced the abandonment his friend had lived. On the other, he understood that pain and struggle, though different, connected them on a level that went beyond words. Anna, for her part, was the most delicate figure in the group, but her serenity in the face of her own condition gave her a depth that David found fascinating. The terminal illness she faced did not seem to weigh her down. On the contrary, it drove her to live each day with an intensity that made her eyes shine. She painted, drew, and wrote, using art as a valve to express that which was sometimes impossible to say with words. "Death doesn't scare me," Anna confessed one day while showing David one of her sketchbooks filled with drawings. "What scares me is leaving without having left something of myself in the world, without having transformed pain into something beautiful." Her words resonated with David, who until then had seen his illness as an enemy. Anna, however, had learned to accept the transience of life, and that gave her a kind of freedom he hadn't imagined possible. From that day on, he began to see his own illness differently. Anna's acceptance, her ability to see beauty even in the fragility of her body, was something he aspired to understand. George, the third member of the group, was the quietest and most reflective. The loss of his brother in an accident had deeply marked him, and in response, he had poured his life into the search for meaning through spirituality and philosophy. George, always calm and measured, listened more than he spoke, and when he did intervene, he did so with a wisdom that surprised everyone. One afternoon, while the group debated life and death, George took the floor in one of those rare moments when everyone was silent. "I believe that death is just a transition," he said, looking at the sky as if his thoughts were rising with the clouds. "My brother left, but I always feel like something of him stayed with me, as if he had left a part of his essence in me. Life, death, I think both are just phases, and what matters is how we live the time we have." For David, George's words carried special weight. He had feared death since the moment he understood the severity of his illness, but with George, he felt that death was not a threat, but just another stage. Deep and sincere conversations with him brought David an unusual peace. Through George, he began to understand that accepting the finiteness of his life didn't mean giving up on it, but living it fully while he could. Afternoons with his friends became sacred moments, a refuge where time seemed to stand still. They spoke of life without haste, as if their words could heal every wound and share every fear. In those spaces, David found a freedom and authenticity he had never felt before. He didn't need to pretend to be strong, nor to bear the expectation of fighting tirelessly. With them, he could be sincere. He could express his desire to free himself from the constant pressure to prolong his life at all costs. One afternoon, as the four sat in the plaza, enjoying the warm light of the sunset, Luke, with his typical carefree tone, tossed out a question that hung in the air. "Have you ever thought about what you would do if you only had one day left to live?" David fell silent, reflecting. His friends took turns answering. Anna confessed she would spend the day painting without rest. George would talk to everyone he loved. And Luke, true to his indomitable spirit, declared that he would run far away to a place where no one could find him. They all laughed, But David remained thoughtful. "I don't know," he finally said. "I think I would spend the day with my mother, and maybe with you too." The group fell silent, as if those words had struck a deep chord. For David, that declaration was a revelation. For the first time, he realized that his life didn't just revolve around his illness or his mother's sacrifices. His friends had shown him a different world, one where he could find peace amid uncertainty, a world where he could decide how to live the time he had left. Thus, with each passing day alongside them, David felt that this philosophy of acceptance and peace was taking root within him. He learned that life could be more than a constant struggle, that he shouldn't feel guilty for not wanting to prolong his suffering, and that sometimes accepting fate was the bravest way to live. His friends taught him that love, freedom, and sincerity didn't need to be fought for, but embraced as natural parts of life. That night, as he returned home, David felt that somehow he had changed. He had begun to understand that his friends were not just a refuge, but an emotional family in which he found the acceptance and peace he so desperately needed. And so, as he gazed at the starry sky from his bedroom window, David began to contemplate the possibility of living his life according to his own will, even if that meant making difficult decisions that his mother wouldn't understand. Mary's life flowed in a cycle of exhausting work that offered no respite. Each day, her strength seemed to diminish a little more, and every step she took felt like carrying an invisible weight that no one else could see. The routine at the factory grew increasingly harsh, and although her hands trembled at the end of each shift, she forced herself to continue with the same determination as always. However, the atmosphere had changed. The demands from her new boss, Anna, grew more intense, as if she were entirely unaware that behind every worker was a story and a life dependent on that job. Anna was a woman with a stern gaze, a rigid posture, and a voice that allowed no objections. Since her arrival, the factory environment had transformed into a tense and controlled space where every minute counted and where every mistake was met with reprimand. Employees, including the most senior and respected, began to fear her, avoiding any direct contact, knowing that a wrong word could mean trouble or even dismissal. For Mary, the change was particularly difficult. She had worked in that factory for years, almost as long as David had been sick. Over all those years, her colleagues had become a sort of second family, and the job, despite its grueling nature, represented a security that allowed her to care for her son. However, with Anna in charge, she felt that everything she had built could come crashing down at any moment. The pressure was constant, and the boss seemed to watch her closely, as if she sensed the weakness in Mary's movements or the tremors in her hands at the end of each shift. That afternoon, during a brief break, Mary sat in a corner of the factory, trying to calm the pain that was beginning to settle in her back. While gently massaging her wrists, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Claire, looking at her with concern. "Mary, you have to take care of your health. Anna isn't worth it," Claire said quietly, fearful that someone might overhear them. Mary sighed, and her usually serene expression seemed to crack for a moment. She knew Claire was right, that the job was demanding a price her body could no longer pay, but she also knew she had no option. Without this job, how would she pay for David's treatment? The thought of being without an income was unthinkable. "I can't afford that luxury, Claire," Mary murmured. "David needs every penny. If I have to put up with Anna, I will, even if it means sacrificing my health." Claire looked at her sadly, understanding her friend's dilemma, but unable to find the right words to comfort her. Mary continued her shift, trying to ignore the aches and twinges of fatigue coursing through her body. However, that day, Anna seemed particularly attentive to any mistake. The boss approached Mary while she was operating one of the machines and, without warning, pointed out a small imperfection in Mary's work. "Ma'am, don't you think you're a bit slow today?" Anna asked, with a coldness that chilled Mary. Mary felt a knot in her stomach. She tried to apologize, but the words barely came out. She didn't want trouble. She couldn't afford a mistake, and yet exhaustion betrayed her, making her more vulnerable with every passing minute. Anna, unyielding, shot her a glance that seemed to pierce through her. "If you can't keep up, maybe this isn't the place for you," Anna added, before walking away without waiting for a response. Anna's words echoed in Mary's mind like a blow. The possibility of losing her job became a shadow that followed her for the rest of the shift, and every movement of her hands seemed to be scrutinized more closely than ever. Despite her fatigue, she made an effort to keep up the pace, repeating to herself that she couldn't afford a mistake, that she had to be strong for David. But by the end of the shift, when she met Claire to leave together, her legs barely held her weight. As they exited the factory, the street was dark and cold. Claire noticed the expression of defeat on her friend's face and tried to offer comfort. "Mary, this can't go on. Anna is pushing you to your limit. You need to talk to someone or look for another job," Claire suggested, worried. "I can't, Claire. I've looked for other options, but everywhere is the same or worse. And even if it weren't, I don't have time. My days are so filled with shifts and doctor's appointments for David that I can't even imagine how to change all of this," Mary replied, her voice heavy with resignation. Claire fell silent, unsure of what else to say. The two women walked in silence the rest of the way, and Mary tried to hide the pain she felt, both in her body and in her soul. The struggle to keep her son safe had turned her into a shadow of the woman she once was, and although she loved David more than anything in the world, she was beginning to wonder if she could endure much longer. That night, after arriving home and seeing her son already asleep, Mary sat in the darkness of the living room. Her hands trembled, and fatigue had taken hold of every muscle in her body. She looked around, observing the humble home she had managed to maintain with such effort. Despite the adversities, it was all for him, for David, so he wouldn't have to worry about anything other than getting better and reclaiming the life that the illness had stolen from him. However, a dark and painful thought crossed her mind. What if all this sacrifice was in vain? What if, despite all her efforts, the treatment didn't work? The idea that her sacrifice might not have a reward felt unbearable and, at the same time, terrifyingly possible. Before going to bed, she took a piece of paper and a pencil and began writing a list of expenses and pending tasks, trying to convince herself that she had control, that her sacrifice and effort would be worth it. When she finally put down the pencil, she looked at the list and felt a weight in her chest. That list was, in a way, a reflection of everything she had given up for the love of her son, but it also reminded her that she was completely alone in this battle. As she lay down in bed, her body pleaded for rest, and her mind tormented her with thoughts of failure and fear. She stared at the ceiling, wishing for relief that seemed to elude her, and as her eyes began to close from exhaustion, she made a silent promise. She would endure whatever was necessary, for him, for David. Anna and her coldness wouldn't stop her, nor would the pain she carried inside. She knew that each day in the factory was a battle, and that every sacrifice she made had a cost. That night, Mary barely slept for a few hours. Inside, her determination remained intact, but it was now accompanied by a shadow of doubt that she couldn't fully dispel. David watched the clock hanging on the kitchen wall, listening to the echo of his mother closing the door as she left for her night shift at the factory. The sound resonated in the silent apartment, reminding him that once again, he was alone. His mother's routine was so rigid that even the moments when the house was empty seemed predictable. Each day, she left before dawn and returned only a few hours after midnight, a constant struggle he observed from a distance, feeling helpless and deep down guilty. Lately, David had begun to feel differently about his mother. Despite his deep love and respect for her, an emotional distance had begun to grow between them. Whenever she tried to get closer, asking how he felt or what he thought, he responded with evasions, steering the conversation towards superficial matters, talking about the weather, a book, or anything that didn't involve his true thoughts. He knew it hurt her, but he also knew that the truth, his truth, was something she could neither understand nor accept. Sitting on his bed, David pulled out a notebook from his desk. He had begun to write down some thoughts, phrases, and sometimes simple words that helped him process the confusion he felt. There, in silence, he wrote about his encounters with his friends, about the peace he found in their acceptance of life as it was, without forcing the future and without the constant pressure to improve. He had found solace in the fact that he didn't have to fight against his illness with them, that he didn't have to pretend hope when he actually felt something closer to resignation and a strange peace that embraced him each day. That night, after a couple of hours of writing in his notebook, David heard the key in the door. It was Mary, returning from her exhausting shift. By instinct, he quickly closed the notebook and tucked it away, as if that collection of thoughts was a secret he needed to keep from her. From the living room, his mother called out softly, "Are you awake, son?" "Yes, Mom, I'm here," he replied, trying to sound relaxed. Mary entered the room, her face marked by fatigue, but still wearing a smile, the same smile David knew well, the one she used to hide the tears, the pain, and the worry she carried with her. He watched her in silence, noticing the lines beginning to form on her face and the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted a blanket over him. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "Good. Same as always," he replied, his gaze diverted toward the window. Mary nodded, as if that detail reassured her, and continued speaking, though David could sense the effort she was making to sound cheerful. He felt trapped between two worlds, his mother's, filled with hope and sacrifice, and that of his friends, where peace and acceptance were the only responses to life's difficult questions. The chasm he felt between himself and his mother grew each day, and although it pained him, he didn't know how to stop it. However, Mary sensed the change in him. With each short response, each evasive glance, each silence, she felt something was pushing her son away, that an invisible barrier was rising between them, making it harder every day to understand what was happening in his mind. As she watched him in silence, she felt the urge to reach out to him, to know what was going on, but she didn't dare press him. David remained reserved, and although she tried to excuse it by telling herself that his illness and adolescence were causing it, her intuition told her that there was something more, something he was hiding from her. Trying to break the silence, Mary asked softly, "Would you like to go out this weekend? We could walk to the park or to somewhere you like." David paused for a moment. His mother watched him with a smile that seemed to plead for a positive response. However, the idea of spending the day at the park, pretending to be normal, did not appeal to him. He desired her company, yes, but he felt like his mother looked at him as if he was still a child, incapable of making his own decisions. "I don't know, Mum. Maybe another day," he responded, his tone colder than he intended. Mary's expression clouded slightly, but she nodded, making an effort not to show her disappointment. She knew her son needed space, and although it hurt her, she tried to respect that. David, for his part, felt the tension grow between them, and when he noticed his mother's sad gaze, he felt a pang of guilt. But despite his affection, he also felt that the space he had found in the company of his friends was something she could not comprehend. The next day, Mary decided she had to do something to reconnect with her son. While working at the house she cleaned, her mind was on David and how she could reach him. She felt he was going through an internal conflict that he did not share with her, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. She remembered Claire's words, who had suggested days earlier that she talk to him without pressuring him, and decided to give it a try. That night, when she got home, she sat at the table with him and, with evident effort, tried to get closer. "David, I know. You've been a bit distant lately. I just want you to know that you can talk to me about anything. I don't want to pressure you, but it worries me to see you like this," she said, in a soft and understanding tone. David looked at her, feeling a mix of affection and resistance. He knew his mother was trying to connect, but he feared that opening up would mean breaking the fragile peace he had worked so hard to establish. It pained him to see her worried, but he also felt that she could not understand the weight of his thoughts, the serenity he had found in accepting the possibility of giving up treatment. "Mom, I'm fine. I just need time for myself," he finally said, avoiding eye contact. Mary felt how his words once again raised that invisible barrier. The feeling of losing her son grew within her, but she decided not to insist. She bid him good night with a gentle touch on his forehead and retreated to her room, wondering if she would ever be able to break that distance that grew more evident with each passing day. David, in the solitude of his room, looked at the notebook where he had written his deepest thoughts and closed it. He knew that, for now, that distance from his mother was inevitable, and although it pained him, he felt he was doing the right thing. Between them, silence grew like an invisible wall, filled with words neither dared to speak. That was the beginning of a silence that would grow deeper, an emptiness that mother and son shared without knowing how to fill it. The factory on the next shift roared with the hum of machines and the echo of hurried footsteps in the hallways, but Mary seemed oblivious to it all. Her mind was still trapped in the image of David, in his short answers, and in the distant expression on his face every time she tried to speak with him. It was becoming increasingly difficult to find a way to connect with her son, and the frustration of not understanding what was happening between them felt unbearable. More than once, she had to hold back tears at seeing him shut down in response to each of her attempts to reach out. Midway through the shift, during one of the few breaks they had, Claire approached Mary and observed her in silence for a moment. She knew her friend was dealing with something difficult. Her tired eyes and slumped shoulders spoke of a worry that went far beyond physical exhaustion. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "Mary, what's going on? You seem worse than usual, and don't tell me it's just work," she said, in a firm but caring tone. Mary sighed, and for a moment her shoulders seemed to give in to the invisible weight she carried. She knew she could trust Claire, that her friend was one of the few people who could understand the struggle she lived through every day. In a low voice, she began to speak. "It's David. I feel like something is pulling him away from me, and I don't know what to do. Every time I try to talk to him, he shuts down. Sometimes I think he's hiding something from me, that there's something in his life he doesn't want me to know," she murmured, her voice cracking slightly at the end. Claire listened attentively, her face reflecting the empathy she felt for her friend. She understood Mary's pain, that desperation of not being able to reach her son. She knew what it meant to her, how every effort she made was focused on his well-being, and how that distance was destroying her inside. "Mary, I understand that you want to be close to him, but sometimes kids need space, even though it's hard to accept," Claire said, her voice soft yet firm. "David is going through a complicated phase. It could be the illness or the fact that he feels limited. He might be dealing with things he still can't express to you." Mary nodded, but uncertainty and fear continued to reflect in her eyes. She knew Claire was right, that David was facing a situation she couldn't fully understand, but she feared that this distance could lead to something irreversible, a separation she wouldn't know how to bear. "But what do I do, Claire? Do I stay on the sidelines and watch him drift away? It breaks my heart to see him evade me, to see him suffer and I can't help him. What kind of mother am I if I can't understand my own son?" she asked, her voice trembling. Claire took Mary's hands and gave them a gentle squeeze, looking at her with an understanding that only someone who has faced their own battles could offer. "You're a mother who loves him deeply, and that's why it hurts you so much. But sometimes, the best way to help is to be there, quietly, without pushing. David needs to feel that he can come to you when he's ready, not that you're waiting to solve everything for him," Claire said. "Give him the space he needs, and trust that the bond you have will be enough for him to approach you when he's prepared." Mary nodded, although her heart resisted accepting that advice. To her, motherhood had always meant closeness and protection, and the idea of giving space felt like an almost unnatural act. However, Claire's sincere expression made her understand that she had to try, even if it was the last thing she wanted to do. Throughout the rest of the shift, her friend's words echoed in her mind. While she worked, she struggled to imagine what it would be like to set aside her own anxieties, to stop trying to resolve David's silence, and instead simply offer him her presence. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The fear of losing him was still there, but if there was any chance her son would come to trust her again, she was willing to try. That night, when she got home, Mary found David in the living room, sitting with a book in his hands, though his eyes seemed unfocused on the printed words. It was as if he were somewhere else, far from that shared space. Upon seeing her, he immediately closed the book and stood up, as if he were about to say something, but then changed his mind and simply murmured a greeting. Mary smiled, trying to offer him a calm expression, free of questions or demands. She made an effort to keep the conversation light, talking about trivial topics, about her day at the factory, about some anecdote involving Claire. And although he responded briefly for the first time in a long while, she noticed that he didn't seem so uncomfortable. However, when he tried to retreat to his room, Mary couldn't help but say something she had been holding back all day. "David, I just want you to know that I'm here, always. No matter what happens or what you need, I'll be here when you want to talk. I won't pressure you. I just want you to remember that you can count on me for anything." David paused, and for a moment his gaze revealed a mix of emotions he found hard to define. Something in his mother's words, in the calm and reproach-free tone she used, gave him a sense of relief, even though he still felt the weight of his thoughts, all that he carried inside and could not express. He nodded slightly, and for a second, Mary thought she saw in him an opening, as if the wall separating them began to crack, even if just a little. "Thank you, Mom," he finally responded softly, and then retreated to his room. Mary remained in the living room, watching the door to his room close, feeling a mix of hope and sadness. Claire's words still echoed in her mind, and she knew this would be a slow process, that the love she felt for her son would have to be patient, silent, and pressure-free. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she also knew it was the only way to give David the space he needed. As she prepared for bed, Mary promised herself that, even though the path was uncertain, she would follow her friend's advice. She knew she couldn't force David to open up, and she understood that her fears would have to take a back seat. He needed time, and she had to be willing to give it to him. Deep down, it pained her to accept that perhaps she would never fully understand what her son carried inside, but she clung to the idea that her love would be enough to keep them connected, even from a distance. That night, as she sank into an uneasy sleep, Mary discovered a new facet of maternal love. Sacrifice was not always physical. Sometimes it meant learning to let go and trust. The morning was cold and grey when Mary decided to clean David's room. It was her day off, one of the few times she could afford to dedicate time to caring for the home without the exhaustion she normally brought back from work. Cautiously, she opened the door to her son's room, finding a space filled with details that spoke of him. Books piled on the desk, a disheveled blanket on the bed, and a notebook half open. It seemed like a scene frozen in time, a capsule of David's life where his thoughts and emotions floated in the air. Mary began to carefully tidy up, picking up clothes and arranging items here and there. She couldn't help but feel a mix of nostalgia and worry as she observed the little traces of her son's life, the details that reflected both his love for reading and his growing isolation. As she worked, her gaze stopped at the shelf where David kept some philosophy and poetry books. She remembered the times she had seen him reading in silence, absorbed in thoughts he did not share with her. When she took out a couple of books to dust them off, a small, slightly crumpled envelope fell to the floor, slipping from her hands. Curious, Mary picked up the envelope and opened it, her pulse quickening. Inside, she found a letter written in David's unmistakable handwriting. At first, she hesitated to read it, feeling it was something private, but the fear of not knowing what was going on in her son's mind was stronger. With a mix of nervousness and apprehension, she began to read, aware that by doing so, she was opening a window into the thoughts he had kept silent. In the first lines, David expressed something that took her by surprise. He spoke of a strange peace he had found, a serenity in accepting his illness. He explained how, after much struggle, hospitals and treatments, he had come to the conclusion that he didn't want to continue with the treatment. For him, the illness was no longer something to fight against, but a reality he could accept without fear. Although he knew this decision could break his mother's heart, David also expressed his desire for her to understand him and, in some way, to find peace in his choice. Each word was a blow to Mary. She felt her heart breaking with each line she read, as if those phrases had been written to liberate him, while for her they were a sentence of pain and despair. It was the first time she had seen so clearly the distance that had grown between them, the distance he had tried to maintain and that she had unsuccessfully tried to close. And now she understood why. David had decided to abandon the fight, and that decision was something he hadn't wanted to share with her. Mary felt the air escape her lungs, the room growing smaller, and her world, which until then had revolved around saving her son, crumbling to pieces. She felt a mix of disbelief, anger, and a pain so deep it seemed to want to tear her soul apart. How could her son make such a decision? After all she had sacrificed for him, every day and night spent awake to keep him safe. How could he accept such a devastating idea? She sat on David's bed, still holding the letter in her trembling hands. The room filled with a heavy silence, as if the very space understood the magnitude of what she had just discovered. In an attempt to comprehend, she read the letter once more, pausing on each word, on each phrase that expressed her son's desire to free himself from the burden of a life filled with pain and uncertainty. Somewhere in her heart, Mary understood that this decision, though painful, came from a place of love. David didn't want her to suffer. He didn't want to continue being the reason for her sacrifice and exhaustion. But for her, this was unimaginable. Her life had revolved around him, and her motherly love compelled her to fight no matter the cost. As soon as she finished reading, she felt sadness transform into anger. She tucked the letter away and stood up, as if the weight of her emotions gave her strength. Determined, she began to search more among David's things. In a small box on the shelf, she found several more sheets, and as she read them, she discovered another revelation that left her breathless. David had been secretly corresponding with his father, Robert, the man who had abandoned them years ago. In those letters, David sought answers to questions Mary had never been able to resolve for him. He spoke of his life, his illness, his feelings and fears, as if he needed a connection with the man who had chosen to distance himself from their lives. Mary felt pain and betrayal consume her. Not only had David decided to give up treatment, but he had also sought Robert, the man she had tried to forget, the man who had never been there for her son and who had no right to know about him. The weight of those revelations was too much. She felt betrayed, abandoned by her own son, who had chosen to share his life and thoughts with someone who had not been there for them. Unable to contain herself, she collapsed onto David's bed, and tears flowed with an intensity she had not remembered feeling in years. The images of all her sacrifices, of every shift at the factory, of every sleepless night, and of every hope placed in David's treatment, swirled through her mind like a whirlwind. She wondered if everything had been in vain, if her love and dedication had not been enough to keep her son in this life. The pain from those letters came not only from David's decisions, but from the realization that there was a part of his life she would never know, a part he had chosen to keep secret. Her son, for whom she had given everything, seemed to have drifted so far away from her that she could no longer reach him. Mary sat in silence, trying to calm herself, to understand. She knew that confronting David wouldn't solve anything, that yelling at him or demanding explanations would only push him further away. Yet something inside her demanded an answer, an explanation that would help her comprehend the emptiness she felt. The only option left was to accept that there were limits to her love, barriers that, though they hurt, she could not cross. David had the right to make his own decisions, to live his life according to his own will. But that did not make her pain any less real. She put the letters away, drying her tears and taking deep breaths to regain control. She knew she had to find a way to broach the subject with him, but for now, she didn't have the strength. With her heart shattered, she closed the door to her son's room and retreated to her own, engulfed in a bitter silence and a sadness she didn't know how to overcome. That night, as she tried to fall asleep, Mary understood that motherhood, love, and sacrifice were not always enough to hold on to those we love. The distance that David had created between them was something she could not control or fully understand. And in that moment of despair, as the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, Mary realized that her struggle to save her son might be destined to remain a solitary and silent battle. Mary woke early after a sleepless night, with swollen eyes and a deep sadness lodged in her chest. The image of David's letters, his words filled with resignation, and the revelation of his contact with Robert replayed in her mind like an endless echo of pain and betrayal. For years, she had done everything she could to protect her son and provide him with a worthy life, even when the weight of David's illness and Robert's abandonment had left her completely alone. And now, in a matter of minutes, her entire world had changed, revealing a truth she had never imagined. She got out of bed feeling exhausted, not from the physical fatigue she was used to, but from an emotional exhaustion she didn't know how to bear. Every corner of the house seemed a reminder of her sacrifices, of the years of struggle, and of the dreams she had accumulated for David. The shifts at the factory, the sleepless nights, and the constant sacrifice were part of her life, all motivated by an unconditional love that now seemed insufficient. With slow steps, she headed to the kitchen, where the sun began to filter through the window, illuminating the space with a gentle warmth. Mary prepared a coffee, her hands trembling as she tried to sort out her thoughts, her emotions, her pain. When David appeared in the doorway with a carefree expression, she felt her heart skip a beat. There was a serenity about him that she couldn't comprehend, a peace that, rather than comforting her, provoked a mix of anger and helplessness. David noticed the serious expression on his mother's face and approached cautiously. He seemed to sense that something had changed, that the usual silence between them was about to be broken. However, Mary remained calm, observing him intently, trying to decipher his thoughts, trying to understand why he hadn't trusted her, why he had chosen this path without even telling her. "Mum, are you okay?" David asked, his voice revealing a mix of concern and reluctance. Mary set the coffee down on the table and looked him in the eye, her expression a blend of love and pain. She knew she couldn't hide the truth from him, that she had to confront the matter even if she feared the answers. With a trembling voice, she dared to ask, "David, I found the letters. I read what you wrote about the treatment, and also the letters to your father." David's face hardened instantly, as if an invisible barrier rose between them. He hadn't expected her to discover those writings, and the discomfort in his gaze was evident. For a few seconds he remained silent, evaluating how to respond, but Mary didn't give him time for an evasive answer. "Why, David?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, laden with sadness. "Why did you decide to stop fighting without even telling me? I've spent my whole life, all my effort on this, and now I realize I know nothing about you." David looked away, taking a deep breath before responding. He knew this moment would come, though he had feared and avoided it. With a serene tone, but marked by sadness, he finally dared to speak. "Mum, I don't want you to keep sacrificing yourself for something I no longer desire. I've learned to accept life as it is, with its finitude, and to find peace in that. I don't want to see you wear yourself out, watching you consume yourself over a fight that I can no longer sustain. David's words pierced Mary like a knife. She felt that every sacrifice, every tear, and every sleepless night had been in vain. Everything she had done, everything she had left behind to save her son, now seemed to lose meaning in light of that decision. She felt betrayed, not only by his choice, but by the fact that he hadn't shared that pain, that resolution with her, his mother. "And the letters to Robert?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you seek out that man, someone who abandoned us, who abandoned you?" David looked at her with pain, knowing that this answer would be even harder to explain. "I sought him out because I needed answers. I wanted to understand why he left, why he chose not to be with us. It wasn't for lack of love for you, Mom. It was because I also needed to understand what it means to live with a loss, with something you can't change," he said, his voice trembling. Mary closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. It hurt to think that, despite her love and dedication, she had not been able to fill the void that Robert had left in her son, that space that, no matter how hard she tried, would always remain an open wound. It hurt her to discover that David had lived with a sadness she had been unable to comprehend, and that in his search for answers, he had found solace in the man who had caused them the most harm. "David, you are my life, my only reason to go on. I've given everything for you. Don't you understand what that means?" Mary said, her voice filled with desperation and love. He nodded slowly, and his eyes filled with tears. This was the moment he had wanted to avoid, the moment when his mother faced the abyss of his decision, an abyss he knew she would never fully accept. "I know, Mom, and that's precisely why I want to free you. I don't want you to keep giving your life for a future that, for me, no longer makes sense," he replied, his voice cracking. "I've found peace, Mom. It's all I want for you, too." Mary felt the world collapse around her. That peace he claimed to have found, far from comforting her, filled her with an unbearable emptiness. She couldn't accept that her son, for whom she had fought and sacrificed everything, wanted to renounce life, and even less could she accept that he believed her love was a burden. For a few seconds, they looked at each other in silence, unable to express the whirlwind of emotions flooding them. Finally, David, in an act of vulnerability, moved closer to his mother and took her hands. It was a simple gesture, but in it lay the love and respect he had always felt for her. "Mom, I don't want this to be a goodbye. I just want you to understand that for me, life is no longer a struggle. I just want to live the time I have left in peace, with you, without you feeling obligated to save me," he murmured, tears in his eyes. Mary couldn't take it anymore and hugged him tightly, as if she wanted to hold on to him and protect him from his own decision. She felt her heart shatter into a million pieces, and although she knew she had to respect her son's will, something inside her refused to accept that emotional farewell. For her, every sacrifice, every effort, and every pain had been motivated by a love that knew no limits or conditions. When they finally separated, Mary felt that something inside her had broken irreparably. She knew David had made a decision, but in her heart, a mother's love could not accept that reality. Yet she also understood that insisting on her struggle would only drive him further away from her. That night, after the confrontation and shared pain, they remained in a fragile silence. Although the distance between them persisted, Mary felt that she had begun to see her son from a new perspective, one in which, even though it was unbearable, she had to accept his wishes. She knew the process would be long and difficult, but inside, she promised herself that she would find a way to respect his decision without losing him, even if it cost her soul. The confrontation with David left Mary with an emptiness that felt irreparable, an open wound that, despite her unconditional love, she didn't know how to heal. For days, She tried to digest what her son had confessed to her, his decision to abandon treatment and his need to find answers in the man who had left them. Every time she thought of Robert, she felt a mix of resentment and pain, an old hurt that now resurfaced with force, rekindling scars she thought she had overcome. But for the sake of David, she decided to confront her own story with Robert. Mary spent her days in a state of uncertainty, trying to continue with her work routine while an emotional battle raged inside her. David's words echoed in her mind, resonating like a painful echo. Although she had promised to respect his wishes, deep down she felt an overwhelming need for answers, to understand why he had chosen to approach his father, to trust him with what he had not shared with her. One afternoon, driven by a mix of necessity and anguish, Mary decided to do something that until then had seemed unthinkable. She searched for the address David had kept in his letters. She found an address that Robert had written on one of the letters, and after thinking about it over and over, she decided to go look for him. It was a difficult decision, and she knew that facing Robert could stir up old pains she wasn't sure she could bear. However, her love for her son and the need to understand what had happened gave her the courage she needed. The address led her to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where the houses were small, and the street's silence reminded her of the many lonely nights she had spent, wondering how someone could simply leave and forget their family. With each step she took, a mix of anxiety and determination filled her. When she arrived in front of the house, she took a deep breath and knocked on the door, feeling her pulse quicken with each passing second. The door opened, and Robert stood before her, his face surprised and his eyes showing an expression that wavered between discomfort and guilt. He was evidently older, with grey hair and a demeanor more tired than Mary remembered. For a moment, they looked at each other in silence. Time seemed to freeze as the weight of the years and unspoken words filled the space between them. "Mary, I didn't expect to see you here," Robert murmured, unsure how to start a conversation that had been inevitable for so long. Mary observed him in silence, holding back the mix of emotions swirling inside her. Although she felt the urgency to speak, to confront him, she took a moment to calm herself and think about what she really needed to say. "Robert, I'm not here for myself," she finally said, with a firm but restrained tone. "I'm here because I need to understand. David has sought you out, and I don't understand why. I don't understand why you responded to his letters after all these years, after abandoning us." Robert looked away, as if her words hurt him as much as they did her, and sighed. For a moment, Mary could see in his eyes a regret she hadn't expected to find. However, her anger and pain kept her distant, unable to feel empathy. "I know I made a mistake, Mary," he replied, his tone broken. "There's no justification for what I did, and I've been living with that guilt for years. When I received the first letter from David, I didn't know how to react. I didn't know if he hated me, if he was writing just to reproach me. But when I read his words, I realized he was looking for something that I don't even know if I can give him." Mary listened in silence, trying to hold back the resentment that had built up over the years. Robert had chosen to abandon his family. He had opted for the easy way out, leaving his son and her adrift in a world that offered only difficulties. And now, after all this time, he had responded to David's letters, allowing him to believe he could find in him the answers she had never been able to provide. "And what is it that he was looking for in you? What did he say?" Mary asked, her voice trembling with frustration. Robert sighed, and in a soft voice, he tried to explain himself. "He was looking for comfort, I think. A comfort that I don't know how to give him because I have no right to occupy that place in his life," he said, and his expression showed a pain that, although sincere, was not enough to alleviate Mary's resentment. "In his letters, he spoke to me about his illness, his exhaustion. He told me that sometimes he felt tired of fighting and that he just wanted peace." Robert's words were a reflection of what David had shared with her in that letter, and each syllable seemed to deepen her pain. She couldn't believe her son had entrusted those thoughts to that man, the one she had tried to forget, that he had found in him a kind of refuge that she, despite all her efforts, had not been able to offer him. "He is my son," Mary said, her tone broken but firm. "I have been there for him from the beginning. I have given everything for him, Robert, everything. And yet, he felt the need to seek you out, to tell you things he couldn't tell me." Robert nodded, understanding the gravity of her words, and fell silent, as if the weight of guilt were crushing him. "I know, Mary, and I have no right to ask for anything. I just wanted to be honest with him, even if it's late. It hurts me to know that I abandoned him when he needed me most, and I know that nothing I say or do can repair the damage. But when I read his letters, I realized that even though I don't deserve his forgiveness, he is looking for something that I also need. Redemption, maybe." Mary felt her anger begin to wane, replaced by a deep sadness. The image of her son secretly writing those letters, seeking answers from a man who had chosen to ignore them, was a pain she would now have to live with. She knew Robert could not give David the answers he sought, but she also understood that her son needed to close a chapter in his life that had, until now, remained incomplete. "He is my life, Robert. You will never understand what it means to see your son in silence, without hope, and know that you can no longer do anything to change it. I have lost him in a way, and although that destroys me, I have to accept his decision. But I will not lose him completely." "I can't," Mary said, her determination showing her strength even amid desolation. Robert nodded, respecting Mary's pain and understanding that any comforting words would be insufficient. "I don't want to interfere in his life or yours, Mary. I just wanted to say that if I can help in any way, if I can offer something to ease the burden, even though I know I don't deserve it, I am willing to do so," Robert said softly. Mary looked at him, feeling that although the wounds would never fully heal, perhaps she could accept his help, not for her sake, but for David. She was aware that her son had found a peace she couldn't comprehend, and that to keep him in her life, she had to allow him to decide, even if that meant accepting Robert's presence at certain moments. With nothing more to say, she bid him farewell and left, carrying with her a mix of relief and pain she didn't know how to manage. She knew the road would be difficult, that reconciling with her son would involve accepting things she didn't understand, but she was willing to try. As she returned home, Mary felt that her heart had undergone a change, a kind of forced acceptance that would allow her to move forward for David, even if it wasn't as she had dreamed. The encounter with Robert left Mary in a state of emotional exhaustion she couldn't shake off. Every word from their conversation replayed in her mind like an echo that deepened her sadness and confusion. She had seen in Robert a humanity and a regret she hadn't expected to find, but that wasn't enough to alleviate the resentment she had harbored for years. However, despite her distrust of him, something inside her told her that the bond David had tried to form with his father was a legitimate search for peace, a peace she couldn't offer him. Aware that what mattered most was her son's well-being, she decided to accept the help Robert had offered. She knew David no longer saw treatment as the solution she had imagined, but she still wanted to give him one last chance, an experimental treatment that, although risky, represented a glimmer of hope, however small. But for that, she would need to gather money she didn't have. So, with the determination that had always characterized her, she contacted Robert and, against all her instincts, asked for his help. Days later, Robert arrived at her house with a serious expression, aware of the tension between them. He held an envelope in his hand and handed it to Mary with a slight tremor in his hands. Mary accepted it without saying anything, knowing that this gesture, although practical, was something she never imagined she would do. Despite her resentment, she understood that if her son had found solace in him, she too had to allow him a space, however minimal, in both their lives. "Thank you for this, Robert," It's not easy for me, but I do it for David, Mary said, not hiding the coldness in her voice. Robert nodded, understanding that his help would not erase the damage he had caused. However, the opportunity to contribute to his son's life, even late, was something that gave him a kind of purpose, a reason to redeem himself, even if only partially. I don't expect you to forgive me, Mary. I just want you to know that I will do whatever I can, whatever you allow me, to help him, he replied, his voice low but filled with sincerity. That moment was awkward, like a reunion of two strangers who shared a history too painful to forget. Mary decided to invite Robert to speak with David, knowing that this gesture could help her son find a peace that, painful as it was, only Robert could offer him. Although this felt almost unbearable, she understood that her love for David had to be stronger than any resentment. Robert nodded, and with hesitant steps, he made his way toward David's room. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, David was sitting on his bed, looking out the window. Upon seeing him, David lifted his gaze, revealing a mix of surprise and caution, as if he still couldn't quite believe his father was there, in his house, after so many years. "Hello, son," Robert murmured, remaining in the doorway as if he feared crossing a threshold that didn't belong to him. David looked at him in silence, his eyes reflecting a mix of emotion and skepticism. For weeks, he had been writing to him, sharing thoughts and feelings he hadn't shared with anyone else. That epistolary bond had been, for him, a sort of catharsis, a way to express his desire to close chapters and find answers. But now, seeing him there in person, he felt an unexpected discomfort, as if the connection they had created on paper was wavering in the reality of their lives. "Dad," David said, his voice trembling. Robert took a few steps forward, still not daring to sit down, and stood next to his son. He knew he had no right to claim any space, that he was there as a stranger, allowed to approach only by grace of those who had waited for him without a response for years. "David, I know I'm late, that I wasn't there when I should have been, and I know that can't be fixed. I don't expect you to understand or forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm here now, willing to be the father I wasn't," he said, his voice heavy with regret. David lowered his gaze, trying to process his father's words. He had longed for this moment, had waited years for a response, a presence that would provide the closure he had always desired. However, now that he had it before him, he felt his emotions intertwining in a way he couldn't control. On one hand, there was the desire to connect and reconcile with him. On the other, a contained anger for all the years of absence. "I can't say that I understand why you left, or that everything is fine," David replied, his voice calm but filled with pain. "But I think I needed to see you, to know that at least you're willing to listen to me, even if it's late." Robert nodded, understanding the gravity of each word from his son. He knew this would be a process requiring time and patience, and that it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to do whatever it took. The conversation between them stretched on for hours. Mary, from the living room, listened to the murmurs, feeling like an intruder in a moment that was both painful and liberating. She knew that this approach between David and Robert was important for her son, that finding answers and reconciling with his father was a part of the process he needed to find peace. However, she couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and relief. Although Robert had returned to occupy, in a sense, a place in her son's life, she knew that this did not strip her of her role. Finally, when Robert said goodbye to David and left the room, Mary found him at the door, his expression reflecting both exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you for this, Mary. I know it wasn't easy for you," Robert said sincerely. Mary looked at him, and for a second, her expression reflected the pain she still felt. She knew she could never fully forget or forgive, but at least she had been able to give her son the opportunity to heal. "I did it for David, not for you," she responded, her voice firm. "I just hope you don't cause him more pain." Robert nodded, and in silence took his leave. That afternoon, Mary felt that, in some way, She had closed a cycle that had been open for years. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, that David would still have decisions to make, but she had set aside her pride and resentment for him, for his well-being, and that was enough. Upon returning home, Mary went to David's room and found him sitting quietly, looking down at the floor. He lifted his gaze upon seeing her and offered a faint smile, a smile that, though dim, reflected a kind of relief. "Thank you, Mom," David said softly. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Mary approached and hugged him tenderly, feeling that gesture was both a farewell to her resentments and a reaffirmation of her unconditional love. She had accepted a reality she never imagined, but at that moment, she understood that to be close to David, she had to let him find his own way. "I just want you to be happy, son." "No matter how," she whispered, with a serenity she was just beginning to experience. David nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that he and his mother had reached a mutual understanding, a shared ground where love and respect were enough to keep them united, even if their paths didn't always align. That night, as she prepared for sleep, Mary felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. She had opened her heart, faced her fears, and let go of her resentment, all for the well-being of her son. She knew that although the road was still uncertain, she had taken an important step toward reconciliation with her own past, and toward a peace she also deserved. After David's reconciliation with Robert, and accepting her ex-partner's financial help, Mary found herself immersed in a mix of hope and resignation. She knew that this last treatment was an opportunity she couldn't let slip away, even though David had made it clear that he didn't want to prolong his life at any cost. However, after their honest conversation, he had agreed to try one last time, not for himself, but for her. For David, this would be his final bet, and they both knew that, regardless of the outcome, this treatment would mark a before and after in their lives. With the funds raised thanks to Robert's money and the sale of some belongings she still had, Mary contacted a clinic in the city that offered experimental treatment for David's condition. The doctors explained that the results were uncertain, but there was a possibility of improving her son's quality of life, a hope that, though remote, meant everything to Mary. That day, Mary and David packed their few belongings and said goodbye to the home that had witnessed so many struggles, sacrifices, and shared moments. Every corner of that house brought back memories of sleepless nights, David's first words, laughter, and tears. Selling the house had been a tough decision, but deep down, she understood that this sacrifice was a continuation of her promise to give David the best possible life, even if it meant letting go of the only place she had ever felt safe. The journey to the city was marked by long silences. David watched the landscape change from the bus window, as if each kilometer they traveled took him to a new and definitive stage in his life. Mary, for her part, watched him out of the corner of her eye, silently wondering if this last effort would be enough, if she could give her son a little more time to live, a time he could seize in his own way, without the limitations of illness. The clinic, located in a quiet neighborhood of the city, had an air of professionalism and hope that instantly calmed her. The doctors welcomed them kindly, calmly explaining the procedure, making no promises of miracles, but assuring them they would do everything possible to improve David's life. Mary found it hard to accept the limitations of medicine, but she clung to the small possibility that this treatment could at least give her son some peace. The first few days were tough. The experimental treatment was aggressive, and the side effects quickly became apparent. David, already accustomed to living with pain, endured it in silence, without complaining, though his mother saw in his eyes the fatigue and discomfort it caused him. Mary stayed by his side, holding his hand, speaking to him tenderly, reminding him that no matter the outcome, he was not alone. In those moments of suffering, her words were a balm for David's soul, and for the first time in years, he felt he was sharing his pain with someone who could understand him, even if only in a limited way. As the weeks progressed, David experienced emotional ups and downs. There were days when he felt strong, as if his body was responding to the treatment and giving him back a bit of the vitality the illness had stolen. During those brief periods of energy, he and Mary took the opportunity to stroll through the clinic's gardens, talking about childhood memories, the dreams they once had, and the little joys they still shared. In those moments, Mary saw again in him the curious child full of love for life he had once been, and she clung to the hope that perhaps the treatment would give him some of that life back. However, there were also dark days. The side effects of the treatment were unpredictable, and more than once, David's body seemed to give in, weakened by fevers, nausea, and extreme fatigue. Mary, watching him suffer, questioned whether she had made the right decision, whether her insistence on keeping him alive was doing him more harm than good. But in those moments of doubt, David, with a soft but firm voice, reminded her that he had accepted this treatment for her because he knew how much it meant to her to try, even if he didn't share her hope. "Mum, it doesn't matter how this ends. What matters is that we're here together, and that you've given me everything you could give me," David said one night, when the pain had subsided enough for him to speak. "I don't want you to blame yourself if things don't turn out as you hope. You've been the best mother anyone could have." Those words filled Mary's eyes with tears. She knew David was speaking from the heart, and although it hurt to accept the reality, she understood he was at peace with his situation, that he had reached an acceptance she herself had yet to achieve. She kissed his forehead, feeling a mix of gratitude and pain, and promised herself that no matter the outcome, she would respect her son's wishes. Days continued, and David's body seemed to adapt to the treatment. His doctors were surprised by the small advances that, although modest, represented an improvement in his quality of life. Gradually, David was able to walk more easily, and the pain crises became less frequent. The improvement wasn't enough to consider it a cure, but it did give both him and his mother the opportunity to live without the constant burden of illness. Finally, after several weeks of treatment, the doctors informed them that David could return home. The results had been better than expected, and although the illness was still present, the improvement in his mobility and the decrease in pain gave them both a renewed sense of hope. Mary, overwhelmed with emotion, hugged her son, and in that moment, she knew that all the sacrifice had been worth it, that every tear, every shift at the factory, every sleepless night had been for this moment, for this small victory. Upon returning home, David and Mary settled into a new apartment, more modest than their old home, but filled with the peace they had managed to achieve. They decided that instead of living worried about the future, they would make the most of the present to create memories and seek a purpose beyond the illness. Inspired by the acceptance he had found among his friends from the library, David dedicated himself to organizing a support group for young people who, like him, faced serious illnesses. With Mary's support, they began to hold meetings at the community center, where other young people could share their experiences and find comfort in a community that understood their pain. Each meeting gave David a sense of purpose he had never felt before, and little by little, his life shifted from revolving around illness to focusing on mutual support and empathy. Mary, for her part, found a new reason to live in helping other families going through similar situations. With Claire and other colleagues' help, she formed a small organization dedicated to providing emotional and financial support to parents who, like her, were fighting for their children's well-being. Through this work, Mary discovered that her experience could be a beacon of hope for others, and that even amidst pain, her love and sacrifice could give meaning to her life. Thus, mother and son found a new purpose, a way to transform suffering into help for others. The story of their struggle became an example of love and strength, and they both understood that although the future was uncertain, the bond that united them was unbreakable. They had accepted that they could not change fate, but they had decided to face it together, with courage and gratitude for the time they had. In this new chapter of their lives, Mary and David, having found peace amid adversity, began to build a legacy of love and hope that would endure in the hearts of those they helped. As the months passed, the support group that David had founded with Mary grew in number and strength. At the community center, young people like him, facing serious or terminal illnesses, found a space where they could express themselves without fear, where vulnerability was accepted, and the hardest words to utter became commonplace. Each meeting transformed into a kind of refuge, a place where pain and uncertainty were shared openly and sincerely. For David, that space was much more than a meeting. It had become a second family. There he reunited with his friends Luke, Anna, and George, who now joined him in the mission to provide support and understanding to other young people who, like them, needed that emotional support. Each of them brought something unique to the group. Luke, with his energy and determination. Anna, with her artistic sensitivity and ability to express the ineffable through art. And George, with his spirituality and ability to find meaning in chaos. The meetings began to transcend the therapeutic and evolve into a place of creation and life. Anna suggested painting and writing workshops where the young people could express their emotions without needing to explain them in words. Under her guidance, those who felt trapped in silence began to find their own voices. The walls of the community center soon filled with paintings and poems, works loaded with deep feelings, fears, and hopes. It was as if each brushstroke and every verse were a release, a declaration of life in the face of death. One day, during one of the meetings, David had an idea. Inspired by Anna's creativity and the reflections George shared at each gathering, he proposed organizing an exhibition at the community center. He wanted the group members to share their experiences and works with the community to help people understand the value of life from the perspective of those who faced their fragility every day. We could show people what it means to live with an illness, but also what it means to find beauty and meaning in each day, David said, excited about the idea. Luke was the first to support the proposal with the same energy that always characterized him. Of course, people need to understand that we are more than our illnesses, that each of us has a story, a purpose. This could be an opportunity to change the way they see us, Luke added with a smile. Anna, with paint-stained hands, nodded excitedly, while George, with his deep gaze, offered words of encouragement, reminding them that accepting life as it was didn't mean giving up hope, but transforming it into something tangible. News of the project spread quickly, and in the following weeks, the community center transformed into a hub of creativity. David dedicated himself to coordinating logistics, organizing spaces, gathering necessary materials, and encouraging each participant to express their truth without filters. Mary, watching her son's enthusiasm, felt a mix of pride and emotion. Seeing David immerse himself in that project brought her a peace she had never felt before, a peace that reminded her that, no matter what the future held, he had found a way to transcend his pain. Mary, for her part, joined the project in a unique way. Inspired by the organization she had founded with Claire, she decided to create a support network for the families of the young people attending the group. She knew that the parents, siblings, and loved ones of those kids were facing a parallel struggle, a battle of love and pain that often remained in the shadows. Thus, while David and his friends prepared for the exhibition, Mary and Claire began organizing meetings with the families, providing them with a space where they could share their fears, hopes, and the emotional weight they carried day after day. These meetings became a refuge for the families, a place where they could express the suffering they often kept silent for the well-being of their loved ones. Mary became a figure of support and strength for them, and although she herself had endured the pain of watching her son suffer, she found in this new mission a reason to move forward. She had transformed her own suffering into an act of love that benefited others, and that purpose gave her life a new sense of meaning. Finally, the day of the exhibition arrived. The community center was filled with people, family members, friends, community members, and curious onlookers who had heard about the project. The walls were decorated with paintings, poems, and photographs that showcased the talent and sensitivity of the young people, works that expressed the value of each moment, the beauty in the ephemeral, and the acceptance of a life full of uncertainties. Anna had prepared a series of abstract paintings that reflected her own relationship with illness, a mix of light and shadow that somehow represented hope and pain intertwined. George, for his part, had written poetic reflections on life and death, texts filled with wisdom that invited visitors to view existence from a spiritual and transcendent perspective. But the most impactful piece was one that David created especially for the exhibition, a collective mural in which each group member contributed an image, a phrase, or a symbol that represented their personal story. The mural was full of colors, textures, and small stories that intertwined into a common narrative, a work that reflected not only each individual's struggle, but also the strength and comfort they found in their community. When it came time to say a few words, David stood in front of the crowd, his eyes filled with emotion. Mary watched him from the back of the room, holding back tears as she listened to him speak. "This mural, this exhibition, is our testimony," David said, his voice firm and serene. "We are not just patients. We are not just sick people. We are human beings who live each day with an intensity that few can understand. We have learned to find meaning in what others consider lost, and today we want to share that with you." David's words resonated in every corner of the room, and the audience responded with warm and prolonged applause. For many, this exhibition was a revelation, a way to see life from a perspective that invited empathy and respect. Visitors walked through the community center with admiring looks. Some moved to tears as they read the stories and saw the talent of those young people who, despite adversities, found beauty and meaning in every brushstroke, in every verse. At the end of the event, David and Mary met in a corner of the room. She hugged him, feeling in her chest the calm that only love and pride could provide. She had watched her son grow, transform, and find a purpose amid pain, and in that moment, she knew that regardless of what the future held, he had left a profound mark on the lives of others. "I'm so proud of you, David. You've accomplished something wonderful," she whispered to him, tears in her eyes. David smiled, grateful, and in his gaze reflected a peace she had never seen before. He had found in his support group and the exhibition a way to transcend his illness, to share his life and lessons with others, and that was a gift that nothing and no one could take away. That night, as the community center fell silent, David and Mary understood that despite the adversities, they had built something beautiful. That support network, that space of creation and healing, was their legacy, a promise that even in darkness, a spark of light could always be found. The void left by Anna was felt in every corner of the community center. Her absence was like an echo resonating in the walls, a reminder of the fragility of life and the deep connection the group had shared with her. David, now at the helm of the group, felt a mix of sadness and responsibility. The promise he had made to Anna gave him strength, but it also reminded him that carrying the group forward was no easy task. Over time, David managed to keep the spirit of the group alive, but there were days when the emotional burden felt heavy. There were meetings where he felt his own words were insufficient, and other days when the fears and insecurities of the group members awakened his own fears. Without Anna, who had always been a pillar of serenity and comfort, he found himself navigating unknown waters, facing doubts and confronting his own limitations. It was during those moments of uncertainty that the presence of his mother, Mary, became fundamental. She had continued working with the families of the young people, providing support and creating a solidarity network that helped ease the pain of those who, like her, lived through their loved one's illness. One day, seeing how dedicated she was, David asked her to join the support group for young people. He knew her experience and strength would be of great help to everyone, and he felt that, in some way, this would also allow them to grow closer, sharing the weight of the promise he had made to Anna. "Mum, I need your help in the group," he said one day, with a mix of vulnerability and trust. "I feel like we can all learn a lot from you, and I think that we could face this together." Mary, surprised by the proposal, felt a warmth in her heart. She knew how much that group meant to her son and understood the emotional weight he carried. She accepted, knowing that this would be a new opportunity for both of them, a new path that would allow them to heal together. Thus, Mary began attending the meetings, sharing her experience as a mother and as someone who had lived through the pain of her son's illness. Her presence became a source of comfort and wisdom for the young people in the group who saw her as a maternal figure and an inspiration. By opening up to them, Mary also realized that she was finding in the group a space to release her own fears and pain, a place where she could be vulnerable without needing to always be strong. With her mother's support, David was able to navigate moments of doubt. Each meeting became an act of love and shared strength. Little by little, the group adapted to Anna's absence, honoring her through creative activities and reflections that kept her legacy alive. In her memory, they organized a series of workshops where members could express themselves through painting, writing, and music, allowing their emotions to find an outlet in art, just as Anna had done in life. One day, during one of the meetings, Luke, who had always been the most energetic and enthusiastic member of the group, proposed something that everyone received with excitement. Why don't we create a book? A book where each one tells their story, their thoughts, their struggles. Something we can share with the world so that others understand what it means to live and find hope amid illness. The idea resonated with everyone, and so the group decided to work on a collective book, a kind of memoir where each could express their own vision of life, death, and the strength they had found in their community. David took on the role of coordinator, gathering each story, poem, and drawing that the group members wanted to contribute. Mary also collaborated, sharing her own words and experiences as a mother, giving a voice to those family members who, like her, silently shared the struggles of their children. For weeks, the community center filled with words, laughter, and tears as each member shared their story. It was a healing process where everyone saw themselves reflected in one another's experiences, understanding that their pain was not unique, that their hopes and fears were shared. In that book, each story united in a chorus of voices that spoke about life from an honest and sincere perspective, without pretensions or false comforts. When the book was finished, they titled it Light at the Threshold, a name representing the strength and acceptance they had found together. They decided to hold a small presentation at the community center to share their work with the community. David, excited and moved, was the one who delivered the opening speech. "This book is our truth, our way of understanding life and death, of finding meaning in pain and uncertainty," David said, looking at each of the attendees. "Here we share our stories so that others can see that even in the darkest moments, there is light." Anna, who was an inspiration to us all, is still here, in every page, in every word, in every thought. This book is a tribute to her and to all those who have found hope amid adversity. David's words deeply touched the audience, and the applause that followed was a reflection of the admiration and respect they all felt for him and the group. That night, each member felt their story had been heard, that their pain had been recognized, and that through this project, they had managed to give a transcendent meaning to their experiences. Mary, watching her son in that role as a leader and inspiration to others, felt a mix of pride and serenity. She knew that David had found a purpose beyond his illness, a mission that, though painful, gave him the strength to move forward. At the end of the presentation, she hugged him tightly, feeling that moment was a reward, proof that all the sacrifice and love she had given had served a purpose. "David, you've done something wonderful. Anna would be so proud of you." "And so am I," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. David looked at her, grateful, and in his eyes reflected the peace he had found on his journey. He had learned to accept his illness, to transform his pain into an act of love, and to find in his group a family, a community of which he would always be a part. That night, As the community center emptied, David and the group members understood that their struggle, although it would never completely end, had been transformed. They had turned suffering into something beautiful, building a support network that transcended time and space, and now, with light at the threshold in their hands, they knew that their legacy of hope and strength would endure, illuminating the path for those who, like them, sought meaning and comfort amid darkness. The days of uncertainty and struggle were behind David and Mary. Over time, David's improvement became more evident, and his physical weaknesses diminished. Although the illness was still part of his life, he had accepted it as a companion, not as a condemnation. Through his work in the support group, his friendship with Luke, George, and the others, and the living memory of Anna, he had found a perspective that transformed each day into a miracle, a gift. The support group he had created continued to solidify, and the influence of light at the threshold, the book they had written together, kept spreading. Each meeting, each testimony, and every conversation reminded David of the importance of being present, of not taking a single moment for granted. Gradually, he had stopped viewing his life as a struggle and began to see it as a celebration of each moment, of every connection he shared with those he loved. One day, while he was at the community center with Mary after a meeting, David felt the need to express something he had held in his heart. They were both sitting in silence, gazing at the center's garden, where the afternoon sun bathed the flowers in soft light. Mary, sensing that her son had something important to say, turned to him and offered a warm, hopeful smile. "Mom," David began, his smile reflecting his gratitude and serenity, "I don't know if I've ever told you how much you mean to me, how grateful I am for everything you've done. I know you never stopped fighting for me, even when I didn't want to keep going myself." Mary felt her heart squeeze at her son's words. She knew he had faced dark moments, and that, during those times, the distance between them had become palpable. However, seeing David's transformation, witnessing him embrace life with such love, filled her with a peace and gratitude she had never imagined. Without saying a word, she took his hand, inviting him to continue. "When Anna left us, her words resonated in my head," David continued, his voice laden with emotion. "She told me that life is a gift, and I realized that she was at peace because she had made her life an act of love. And that's what you've done too, Mum. You've given me not only the chance to live, but a reason to do so, an example of how love can transform any suffering into something beautiful." Mary felt her eyes fill with tears. She had heard her son express gratitude many times, but in that moment, those words carried a special weight, a depth that went beyond what she had ever expected to hear. "Son, a mother's love is something that doesn't need to be explained," she said tenderly. "Everything I've done has been for you, because seeing you well, seeing you happy, is the greatest reward I could ever have." David looked at her, his eyes reflecting the immense gratitude he felt. He knew that his life, despite its challenges, was a testament to his mother's love, her tireless sacrifice, and her faith that despite adversity, there was always hope. In that moment, he felt the need to offer her a reflection, a promise that the love she had given him would never be lost. "Mum, you've taught me that love is something that isn't measured in time, sacrifices, or successes. It's something that is given, that is sown, and that grows in ways we never imagined. You've given me life twice, the first time when I was born, and the second, when you never gave up, when you wouldn't accept that I would go without a fight. Today I'm here because you chose to never abandon me, and you have no idea how grateful I am for that." Mary felt her tears finally fall, but instead of sadness, they were filled only with gratitude and immense peace. Hearing her son express his love and appreciation in that way was something she had never anticipated, a gift that confirmed that all her effort, all her sacrifice, had been worth it. She caressed his face, smiling through her tears, and in that gesture, They both understood that the love they shared was indestructible, a light that would continue to shine in their lives no matter what the future held. "Thank you, son, for also giving me a reason to keep going," Mary whispered to him. "Your life is the reflection of all the love we share, and it makes me so happy to see that you've found peace, that you've found a purpose." David hugged her, feeling that the bond between them had grown even stronger. He knew his path would still be filled with challenges, but he also knew that as long as he had his mother by his side, he would always have a reason to move forward, a reason to turn each day into an act of love and gratitude. That night, as they said goodbye and David retreated to his room, he wrote in his notebook one last reflection, one that reflected all he had learned on his journey and the love his mother had given him. "Life is a gift, and that gift, for me, takes the form of maternal love. It is the love that never gives up, that crosses shadows and brings light in the darkest moments. It is the love of a mother who, expecting nothing in return, gives us her life, her hope, and her faith, so we can find in every dawn a new opportunity to be happy. Thank you, Mom, for never giving up on me." With that reflection, David felt he had reached a full understanding of love, a love that would endure in each day, in every effort, and in every shared smile with his mother. In that love, he found peace, strength, and above all, the certainty that life, with its challenges and moments of pain, was truly a gift that was worth it. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Leave us your comments below. We love hearing from you. See you in the next video. Take care and see you soon.